The gavel came down like a death sentence, echoing through the packed military courtroom where a decorated naval officer sat in silence, watching her entire career being systematically destroyed by lies. Commander Sarah Chen had endured 3 days of public humiliation, her service record torn apart piece by piece, her medals called fraudulent, her integrity questioned by a judge who seemed to take personal pleasure in her downfall. The gallery of junior officers smirked and whispered. The media scribbled notes for tomorrow's headlines about another stolen valor case, and everyone in that room believed they were witnessing the fall of a fraud. But what none of them knew, not the arrogant judge, not the ambitious prosecutors, not the sneering spectators, was that they were about to witness something that would haunt their careers forever. Because in less than 60 seconds, when Judge Admiral Morrison asked Commander Chen her rank as one final mocking insult, her quiet answer would trigger an earthquake that would bring a Fleet Admiral crashing through those courtroom doors, reduce grown men to trembling silence, and expose the most catastrophic mistake in naval justice history. The woman they thought was a nobody was about to reveal she was someone so far above their clearance level that her true identity had been classified for national security. And the reckoning was coming faster than any of them could imagine. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you value stories of hidden courage and justice served, consider subscribing to support more untold stories like this one. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The Naval Justice Building at Naval Station Norfolk stood like a monument to military order, its imposing brick facade and gleaming windows reflecting the harsh Virginia sun. Inside, Courtroom 7 buzzed with an energy that felt more like a sporting event than a solemn military proceeding. Word had spread throughout the base about the stolen valor case that was about to conclude, and officers who normally had no business in a courtroom had found reasons to attend. Commander Sarah Chen sat at the defendant's table, her posture military straight, despite 3 days of relentless assault on her character. At 38, she possessed the kind of quiet presence that made people look twice, not because she demanded attention, but because something about her suggested depths they couldn't fathom. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her service dress blue uniform impeccable despite the circumstances. The only hint of the storm she'd weathered were the faint lines around her eyes and a small scar that traced along her left temple, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. She had refused legal counsel, a decision that had baffled everyone from the court clerk to the senior officers observing from the gallery. Public defenders had pleaded with her to accept representation. JAG lawyers had offered their services pro bono. She'd declined them all with the same quiet courtesy she showed everyone, explaining simply that she preferred to represent herself. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that no lawyer could defend her without accessing files that didn't officially exist, without revealing operations that had never happened, without breaking oaths that transcended any individual career or reputation. Across the aisle, Captain Marcus Westfield arranged his files with the precision of a man who had already won. At 45, Westfield had built his career on high-profile prosecutions, each one a stepping stone toward the admiral's stars he coveted. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his uniform adorned with ribbons that told the story of a competent but unremarkable career. He'd prosecuted 17 stolen valor cases with a perfect conviction rate, and Sarah Chen was about to become number 18. Behind him sat his team of 3 junior JAG officers, their laptops open, their confidence absolute. They had spent weeks building what they considered an airtight case. The evidence was overwhelming. Chen's official service record showed a career spent entirely in logistics and supply operations. Her claimed combat deployments couldn't be verified through normal channels. Her decorations, including a Navy Cross and 3 Silver Stars, appeared nowhere in the standard military databases. The gallery was packed beyond capacity. In the front rows sat senior officers from various commands, their presence lending gravity to the proceedings. Behind them, junior officers and enlisted personnel filled every available seat, drawn by the spectacle of watching a decorated officer's fall from grace. Near the back, a handful of reporters scribbled notes, already crafting headlines about military fraud and stolen heroism. Judge Admiral Morrison presided over it all with the bearing of a man who believed deeply in his own importance. At 62, Morrison had reached flag rank through political acumen rather than operational excellence. His service record was respectable, but unremarkable. Staff positions, Pentagon assignments, the kind of career that kept ambitious officers clean but rarely tested their mettle. He wore his authority like expensive cologne, heavy and impossible to ignore. Morrison had already demonstrated his contempt for Sarah throughout the proceedings. His questions dripped with condescension, his rulings consistently favored the prosecution, and his comments to the gallery made it clear he considered her a fraud who deserved whatever punishment awaited her. As the afternoon session began, Morrison called the court to order with his characteristic theatrical flair. "This tribunal will come to order. We are here to conclude the case of the United States Navy versus Commander Sarah Chen, who stands accused of fraudulent representation under the Stolen Valor Act, conduct unbecoming an officer, and falsification of military records." His voice carried across the packed courtroom, reaching the overflow seating in the hallway where junior personnel strained to hear every word. The evidence presented over the past 3 days has painted a clear picture of deception, fraud, and a shocking disregard for the honor that our decorations represent. Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands folded on the table before her, her expression neutral. She had mastered the art of invisibility long before this courtroom, learned to endure scrutiny without flinching, to absorb punishment without breaking. 3 days of humiliation had failed to crack her composure, though those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tension in her jaw, the way her breathing had become carefully controlled. Morrison continued his theatrical summary, playing to his audience. "We have heard testimony from respected veterans who recognize the defendant's fraudulent claims. We have seen documentary evidence proving that her alleged service record is impossible to verify through official channels. We have witnessed her complete inability to provide credible evidence for any of her claimed achievements." Captain Westfield rose, smoothing his uniform jacket. "Your Honor, if I may, the prosecution would like to present one final piece of evidence before closing arguments." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Proceed, Captain." Westfield activated the courtroom's display screens, which filled with what appeared to be official military documentation. These are the complete unredacted service records for Commander Chen, obtained through proper channels after extensive review by the appropriate authorities. The documents painted a picture of steady but unremarkable service, supply operations in Norfolk, logistics coordination in San Diego, administrative duties in Hawaii, no combat deployments, no special operations assignments, no circumstances that would justify the decorations she claimed to have earned. As you can see, Your Honor, there is absolutely no evidence in Commander Chen's official record of the heroic service she has claimed. No combat deployments to justify her Purple Hearts, no special operations assignments to explain her Navy Cross, no circumstances that would warrant the silver stars she wears. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Some of the junior officers exchanged knowing glances, their suspicions confirmed. The reporters leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. Morrison studied the documents with exaggerated care before looking directly at Sarah. "Commander Chen, you have had 3 days to provide evidence supporting your claims. You have refused counsel, refused to call witnesses, refused to mount any meaningful defense. Do you have anything at all to say in response to this evidence?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "No, sir." Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying none of the desperation or anger that Morrison seemed to expect. The simple answer only seemed to infuriate him more. "No, sir." Morrison's voice rose. "Commander, you stand accused of wearing decorations you never earned, claiming service you never performed, dishonoring every legitimate recipient of the awards you fraudulently displayed, and your only response is, 'No, sir?' That is correct, Your Honor." The exchange sent another wave of whispers through the gallery. Some observers interpreted her silence as guilt, others as arrogance. None understood it as what it truly was, an unbreakable commitment to oaths that transcended personal reputation or career advancement. Morrison's patience, always thin, finally snapped. He leaned forward on the bench, his voice taking on the prosecutorial tone he'd favored during his own JAG career decades earlier. "Commander Chen, perhaps you don't understand the gravity of your situation. You are facing federal charges that could result in years of imprisonment, forfeiture of all military benefits, and dismissal from the service with the most dishonorable conditions possible." Sarah's expression didn't change. "I understand, sir." "Then explain to this court how a supply officer with no combat experience came to possess 3 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, and 2 Purple Hearts. Explain how someone whose official record shows no deployments outside the continental United States managed to earn decorations reserved for extraordinary heroism in combat." The question hung in the air like a challenge, every eye in the courtroom fixed on Sarah, waiting for her response. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, pressing against the assembled officers like a physical weight. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice unchanged. "I cannot provide that explanation, sir." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "Cannot or will not, Commander." "Cannot, sir!" Captain Westfield seized the moment, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, the defendant's refusal to explain her alleged service speaks volumes. She cannot explain it because it never happened. She cannot provide evidence because no evidence exists. She cannot call witnesses because no legitimate witnesses to her supposed heroism exist." He turned to face the gallery, playing to his audience with practiced skill. "What we have here is a case of stolen valor in its most pernicious form. Not the crude lies of a civilian pretending to be a veteran, but the sophisticated deception of a serving officer who has perverted the system from within." Westfield's voice grew stronger, more confident with each word. "Commander Chen has spent years wearing decorations she never earned, accepting recognition she never deserved, profiting from valor that belongs to others. She has shaken hands with admirals who believed they were honoring a war hero. She has received promotions based on a service record that is fundamentally fraudulent." The courtroom was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, caught up in the drama of the moment. "But perhaps most damaging of all," Westfield continued, "she has betrayed the trust of every legitimate recipient of these decorations, every SEAL who earned their trident in blood, every Marine who earned their Bronze Star under fire, every soldier who came home wounded and proud of their Purple Heart. She has stolen from all of them." Morrison nodded approvingly throughout Westfield's speech, occasionally glancing at Sarah as if expecting some reaction. She remained motionless, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the courtroom walls. When Westfield finished, Morrison addressed Sarah directly. "Commander, you have heard Captain Westfield's characterization of your conduct. Do you wish to respond?" "No, sir." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Very well. Let the record show that the defendant continues to refuse to mount any defense of her actions." He shuffled through his papers with theatrical emphasis before continuing. "Commander Chen, this court has been extraordinarily patient with your unusual approach to legal proceedings. We have allowed you to represent yourself, despite clear evidence that you lack the competence to do so effectively. We have given you every opportunity to explain your actions, to provide evidence of your claimed service, to demonstrate that these charges are unfounded." His voice grew harder with each sentence. "Instead, you sit in silence, offering no defense, no explanation, no evidence. Your behavior suggests either profound arrogance or an admission of guilt." Sarah's hands, folded on the table before her, tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the first crack in her composure that anyone had noticed, so slight that only the most observant might have caught it. Morrison saw it and pressed his advantage. "Perhaps you believe that your current rank protects you from accountability. Perhaps you think that your position as a commander entitles you to special treatment. Let me be clear, Commander Chen. No one is above the law, regardless of their rank or position." He paused dramatically, allowing his words to sink in before delivering what he clearly intended as a devastating blow. "Or perhaps you've become so invested in your own lies that you actually believe them. Perhaps you've told your story so many times that you've convinced yourself it's true. The suggestion of mental instability sent another ripple through the gallery. Some officers exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to see Sarah not as a criminal, but as someone deserving pity, a deluded woman who had lost touch with reality. Westfield stood again. Your Honor, if I may, the prosecution has one additional witness we would like to call. Morrison checked his watch. Very well, Captain. Call your witness. The prosecution calls Senior Chief Petty Officer Robert Martinez. A Hispanic man in his mid-40s entered the courtroom wearing dress blues adorned with the ribbons of 23 years of faithful service. He moved with the confidence of a senior enlisted leader, his bearing erect, his manner respectful but not deferential. As he was sworn in, several officers in the gallery nodded recognition. Martinez was known throughout naval special warfare as a consummate professional. Westfield approached the witness stand with obvious satisfaction. Senior Chief Martinez, please state your current position for the record. I'm currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command as a senior instructor and operations coordinator, sir. And your experience with special operations personnel? 23 years in the team, sir. I've served with SEALs, Force Recon, and various special operations units across multiple deployments. Westfield nodded approvingly. Senior Chief, are you familiar with the defendant, Commander Chen? Martinez glanced at Sarah, his expression neutral but thoughtful. I know of her, sir. Can you tell the court the nature of your knowledge? Martinez hesitated for just a moment, so briefly that most wouldn't have noticed. I've heard stories, sir, claims about operations and achievements that don't match anything in the official records. And in your professional opinion, based on your extensive experience with legitimate special operations personnel, what do you make of these claims? Again, that brief hesitation. Martinez's eyes flicked to Sarah once more before he answered. In my experience, sir, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I haven't seen any evidence that would support the stories that have circulated. Westfield smiled with satisfaction. No further questions. Morrison looked to Sarah. Commander Chen, do you wish to cross-examine the witness? Sarah looked directly at Senior Chief Martinez for the first time since he'd entered the courtroom. Their eyes met and held for several seconds, an exchange that seemed to carry weight beyond what any observer could understand. No questions, sir. Martinez was dismissed, but as he walked past the defendant's table, he slowed almost imperceptibly. Without looking at Sarah, he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. Semper Fi, ma'am. The words were so quiet that only Sarah caught them. She closed her eyes briefly, the first visible sign of emotion she'd shown throughout the proceedings. As Senior Chief Martinez left the courtroom, the weight of his testimony seemed to settle over the proceedings like a shroud. Here was a man whose credibility was unquestioned, whose experience was extensive, and whose professional opinion carried enormous weight within the special operations community. His careful words had delivered what many in the gallery saw as the final blow to Sarah's credibility. Morrison seized the moment. Commander Chen, you have now heard testimony from Senior Chief Martinez, one of the most respected professionals in naval special warfare. His assessment of your claimed achievements is clear. Do you still maintain that you earned the decorations you wear? Sarah's response was barely audible. Yes, sir. Despite having no evidence to support your claims? Sir, Sarah began, then stopped herself. For a moment, it seemed as though she might finally break her silence, might offer some explanation or defense. The courtroom held its breath. But then her composure reasserted itself, and she returned to her previous posture of quiet dignity. I cannot provide the evidence you're requesting, sir. Morrison's frustration was now barely contained. Cannot or will not, Commander, because there's a significant difference. Cannot, sir. The judge's voice rose to just below a shout. Commander Chen, this court has been more than patient with your evasions. You sit before us wearing decorations that cannot be verified, claiming service that cannot be documented, and refusing to provide any explanation whatsoever for these discrepancies. Your silence is not mysterious or dignified. It is contemptuous. He stood, his robes flowing dramatically as he began to pace behind the bench. In 37 years of military service, I have never encountered such blatant disregard for military justice. You show no remorse, offer no explanation, provide no defense. You simply sit there, as if this proceeding is beneath your notice." Sarah's breathing remained steady, but those watching closely might have noticed her hands press more firmly against the table, her knuckles showing the slightest hint of white tension. Morrison continued his verbal assault. "Perhaps you believe that your silence makes you appear noble or mysterious. Perhaps you think that refusing to defend yourself somehow validates your false claims. But I assure you, Commander, your silence speaks volumes, and what it says is that you are guilty of every charge brought against you." Captain Westfield rose again, clearly sensing an opportunity to deliver a knockout blow. "Your Honor, if I may, the prosecution would like to present one final piece of evidence." "Proceed, Captain." The courtroom screens activated again, this time displaying a series of photographs that caused an immediate stir in the gallery. The images showed Sarah at various military functions over the years, award ceremonies, promotion celebrations, formal dinners. In each photo, she was clearly visible wearing the decorations now in question. "These photographs span the past 8 years of Commander Chen's career," Westfield explained. "They show her consistently wearing decorations she claims to have earned, accepting congratulations for service she claims to have performed, receiving recognition for heroism she claims to have demonstrated." He paused for effect before continuing. "But what makes these photographs particularly damaging is that they were taken at events where her supposed combat service was specifically being honored. Admirals' receptions for Purple Heart recipients, ceremonies recognizing Navy Cross recipients, gatherings celebrating the heroism of special operations personnel. The images were indeed damaging. They showed Sarah not just wearing the decorations, but seemingly accepting recognition specifically for the service those decorations represented. To the gallery, they painted a picture of sustained, deliberate deception. "Commander Chen has spent years living a lie," Westfield concluded, "not just wearing fraudulent decorations, but actively participating in events meant to honor legitimate heroes. She has stolen recognition that belonged to others, accepted applause that should have gone to true warriors, received respect reserved for those who actually bled for their country." Morrison studied the photographs with obvious disgust before turning his attention back to Sarah. "Commander, these images show you not just wearing questionable decorations, but actively participating in events meant to honor recipients of those decorations. How do you explain this behavior?" Sarah's voice was steady, but had grown even quieter. "I cannot explain it in this setting, sir." "Cannot explain it in this setting?" Morrison's voice dripped with contempt. "Commander, this is a court of law. This is exactly the setting where you must explain your actions. There is no other setting where such explanations would be appropriate." The judge's tone became almost mocking. "Are you perhaps waiting for some imaginary higher authority to arrive and validate your claims? Are you expecting classified documents to magically appear and vindicate your story? Because I assure you, Commander, no such salvation is coming." His words proved more prophetic than he could have imagined. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, there was something different in her expression, not defeat, but a kind of quiet resolution, as if she had come to terms with something that had been weighing on her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still quiet but somehow carrying more weight than it had before, "I understand that my silence is frustrating to this court. I understand that it appears contemptuous or evasive. But I took oaths that transcend my personal comfort, my reputation, or even my freedom." It was the longest statement she had made during the entire proceeding, and it caused the courtroom to fall into complete silence. Morrison leaned forward, sensing that she might finally be ready to break. "What oaths, Commander? What possible oath could justify defrauding the United States Navy and dishonoring legitimate recipients of military decorations?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Oaths that I cannot break, sir. Not for this court, not to save my career, not to preserve my freedom. Some things matter more than personal consequences." The statement sent another wave of murmurs through the gallery. Some interpreted it as noble stubbornness, others as delusional fantasy. None understood it as what it truly was, the final line of defense for secrets that could affect national security and the lives of operators still in the field. Morrison's patience finally snapped completely. "Commander Chen, I have had enough of your evasions, your mysteries, and your supposed noble silence. You will provide this court with a clear, factual explanation of how you claim to have earned your decorations, or you will be found guilty of stolen valor, conduct unbecoming an officer, and fraud." He paused dramatically before delivering what he clearly intended as the final blow. "And since you seem so fond of military protocol and respect for rank, let me ask you one final question before I render judgment." His voice took on a mocking, condescending tone. "What exactly is your rank, Commander Chen? Not the rank shown on your uniform, not the rank listed in your fraudulent file, but your actual rank, the rank you truly hold based on legitimate service rather than fabricated heroism." The question was meant as a final humiliation, a way to force her to acknowledge that she was exactly what her official file claimed, a career logistics officer who had delusions of grandeur. Morrison's lips curved into what might have been called a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Come now, Commander. Surely you can answer that simple question. What is your actual rank in the United States Navy?" The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Every person present leaned forward, sensing that they were about to witness the final moment of Sarah Chen's disgrace. Sarah stood slowly, her movement precise and controlled. She looked directly at Judge Admiral Morrison, then at Captain Westfield, then at the packed gallery behind her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. "My actual rank, sir, is Fleet Admiral." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the courtroom in waves. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed, no one seemed capable of processing what they had just heard. Because Fleet Admiral was a rank that hadn't existed in the United States Navy since 1945. A rank reserved for wartime commanders of entire oceanic theaters. A rank held by legends like Nimitz and Halsey. A rank that, if it existed at all in the modern Navy, would make Sarah Chen the highest-ranking officer in the entire United States military. And in the stunned silence that followed her impossible answer, the courtroom doors exploded open with a sound like thunder, and everything changed forever. The doors didn't just open. They detonated inward with the force of an explosion, the heavy oak panels slamming against the walls with a sound that made every person in the courtroom jump. But it wasn't the noise that froze 300 hearts in an instant. It was what came through those doors. Fleet Admiral William Bull Harrison entered like a force of nature given human form. At 68, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had commanded aircraft carrier battle groups, who had stared down foreign admirals, who had briefed presidents in the Situation Room during international crises. His dress-white uniform was so pristine, it seemed to glow, adorned with ribbons that told the story of 47 years of naval service across every ocean on Earth. Behind him came his entourage, not staff officers or aides, but the kind of senior leadership that made junior officers' knees weak with terror. A 3-star vice admiral whose chest bore the trident of naval special warfare. A 2-star rear admiral whose combat action ribbon and Purple Hearts spoke of command under fire. 2 Marine brigadier generals whose force reconnaissance backgrounds were evident in their predatory alertness. But it was the man bringing up the rear who caused the most experienced officers in the gallery to go pale with recognition. General Marcus Reaper Donovan, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, entered last, his presence so commanding that even Fleet Admiral Harrison seemed to defer to him with subtle body language. The courtroom, which moments before had been buzzing with shock and confusion over Sarah's impossible claim, fell into a silence so profound that the air conditioning seemed loud as a jet engine. 300 people held their breath, their minds struggling to process what was happening. Fleet Admiral Harrison's eyes swept the courtroom like radar, cataloging faces, assessing the situation with the same tactical precision he'd once used to evaluate enemy positions. When his gaze fell on Judge Admiral Morrison, still frozen behind his bench, mouth slightly agape. There was no warmth, no collegial recognition, despite their shared flag rank. There was only the cold assessment of a superior officer discovering a subordinate's catastrophic failure. "What?" Fleet Admiral Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "In the name of all that is holy is happening in my Navy?" The question was directed at Morrison, but it might as well have been addressed to the universe itself. Morrison, who moments earlier had been the undisputed master of his courtroom, now looked like a midshipman caught cheating on his final exam. "Sir, this is a court-martial proceeding for," Morrison began. "I know exactly what this is supposed to be," Harrison cut him off, his tone making it clear that Morrison's explanation was neither requested nor welcome. "What I want to know is why I received a flash priority message from the Secretary of the Navy informing me that one of our most classified assets is sitting in a public courtroom being accused of stolen valor." The words hit the gallery like a physical blow. Flash priority messages from the Secretary of the Navy were reserved for national emergencies, international crises, or matters of the highest security concern. They weren't sent about routine court-martial proceedings. Captain Westfield, who had been standing frozen since Harrison's entrance, finally found his voice. "Sir, with all due respect, the defendant's claims of classified service cannot be substantiated through normal channels. We have—" He never finished the sentence. General Donovan's gaze fell on him like a targeting laser, and Westfield's words died in his throat. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs looks at you with the expression of a man deciding whether you're worth the effort of a court-martial or if administrative destruction would suffice, speech becomes impossible. "Captain," Donovan said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of distant thunder, "I strongly advise you to remain silent until you understand exactly how far out of your depth you are." Meanwhile, Sarah Chen remained seated at the defendant's table, her expression unchanged from the calm dignity she'd maintained throughout 3 days of humiliation. But those watching closely might have noticed the slightest relaxation in her shoulders, the way her breathing had become more natural. For the first time since the proceedings began, she wasn't alone. Fleet Admiral Harrison approached the bench, his stride measured and purposeful. Morrison instinctively stood, recognizing the approach of a superior officer, even as his mind struggled to process the implications. "Admiral Morrison," Harrison said, his voice now carrying a tone that senior officers used when they were about to end careers. "I need you to explain to me how a court-martial proceeding was initiated against a flag officer without proper notification going through the appropriate channels." Morrison's face went white. "Sir, the defendant's rank is commander. Her file shows exactly what it's supposed to show," Harrison interrupted. "Her cover file, Admiral Morrison. The one designed to protect operational security for missions you lack the clearance to know about, much less adjudicate." The revelation hit the courtroom like a secondary explosion. Cover files were real, but they were the stuff of legend, used only for the most classified operations. The idea that someone would spend years living under a false identity for operational security was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in the sterile reality of military bureaucracy. Harrison continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "Do you have any idea, any conception whatsoever of the damage you've done, the security breaches you've created, the operations you've potentially compromised?" Morrison tried to respond, but Harrison wasn't finished. "This woman has spent 3 days being publicly humiliated for wearing decorations she earned with blood, being accused of claiming service she performed under conditions that would break most men, being called a fraud by people who lack the security clearance to know she exists." Harrison turned to address the entire courtroom, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed gallery. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Fleet Admiral Sarah Chen, United States Navy, architect of Operation Neptune's Fury, commander of Joint Task Force Trident, the woman who planned and executed the extraction of American hostages from the Iranian embassy siege of 2019. The officer who coordinated the multinational response to the Somalia crisis of 2020. The flag officer whose tactical brilliance saved 6 carrier battle groups during the Taiwan Strait incident last year. Each revelation hit the gallery like a physical blow. These weren't just operations, they were the stuff of classified legend, the kinds of missions that junior officers whispered about in secure facilities, never knowing if they were real or elaborate rumors. Harrison wasn't finished. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories. Like this one, Fleet Admiral Chen has spent the last 8 years operating under deep cover, maintaining her false identity while coordinating some of the most sensitive operations in naval history. She has personally planned missions that saved thousands of American lives, prevented international wars, and maintained the balance of power in 3 different oceanic theaters. The silence in the courtroom was now absolute, broken only by the barely audible sound of 300 people trying to breathe without making noise. And for the last 3 days, Harrison concluded, his voice carrying a fury that made flag officers throughout the gallery involuntarily straighten in their seats. She has endured public humiliation rather than break the operational security that protects ongoing missions and the lives of operators still in the field. If you're hooked on this story of hidden courage, subscribe and turn on notifications for more inspiring military stories. Morrison looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in a minefield. His face had gone from white to gray, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the bench. "Sir, I had no way of knowing. The defendant refused to provide any evidence of her claimed service, refused to call witnesses, refused to mount any defense." Harrison's expression didn't soften. "Because she couldn't, Admiral Morrison. Because doing so would have required revealing classified information that you lack the clearance to hear, much less adjudicate. Because she was following her oath to protect national security even at the cost of her own reputation and freedom." General Donovan stepped forward, his presence adding weight to an already explosive situation. "Admiral Morrison, I need you to understand something. Fleet Admiral Chen has been operating under presidential authorization for the past 8 years. Her cover identity, her service record, her entire official existence has been crafted by the highest levels of government to protect operations that could affect global stability. The revelation that presidential authority was involved sent another shockwave through the courtroom. This wasn't just about military chains of command or operational security. This was about national policy at the highest levels." Donovan continued, his voice carrying the weight of ultimate authority. "When you initiated these proceedings, you didn't just attack a decorated officer. You attacked a presidential initiative. You compromised operations that took years to establish. You endangered the lives of American operators who depend on the security of Fleet Admiral Chen's cover identity." Captain Westfield, who had remained silent since his earlier humiliation, finally found his voice again. "Sir, with all due respect, how are we supposed to know? If the defendant's true service was classified, there should have been some mechanism to prevent these charges from being filed." Harrison's gaze shifted to Westfield, and the captain immediately regretted speaking. "Captain, there was a mechanism. It's called proper investigation before filing charges. It's called verifying your evidence through appropriate channels. It's called understanding that when a decorated officer refuses to defend herself, there might be reasons beyond guilt or arrogance." Harrison reached into his jacket and withdrew a tablet computer, its screen displaying classified documents that made several senior officers in the gallery instinctively look away. "Would you like to see Fleet Admiral Chen's actual service record, Captain? Her real decorations? Her authentic operational history?" The images on Harrison's tablet, though visible only to those at the front of the courtroom, showed mission reports that read like military fiction, hostage rescues with 0 casualties, intelligence operations that prevented terrorist attacks, tactical innovations that had been adopted throughout the fleet. Fleet Admiral Chen didn't earn 3 Silver Stars, Captain Westfield. She earned 7. She didn't earn 1 Navy Cross. She earned 4. Her Purple Heart's number 6, not 2, and each one represents wounds sustained while protecting American interests in situations that officially never happened. Westfield's face had gone ashen. His carefully constructed case was crumbling, not just piece by piece, but in its entirety. Everything he thought he knew, every assumption he'd made, every bit of evidence he'd presented was being revealed as a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. Morrison tried to reassert some control over his courtroom. Admiral Harrison, while I understand that classified operations require security, surely there was some way to... Some way to what? Harrison's voice rose for the first time, causing junior officers throughout the gallery to flinch. Some way to compromise. 8 years of operational security to satisfy your curiosity? Some way to reveal ongoing missions to prevent a court-martial that should never have been authorized in the first place. Harrison turned to address Sarah directly for the first time since entering the courtroom. Fleet Admiral Chen, you have my profound apologies for what you've endured. You have the apologies of the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of Defense, and the President of the United States. Your conduct throughout these proceedings has been exemplary, maintaining operational security even under the most extreme personal cost. Sarah stood slowly, her movement precise and controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried new authority, not the quiet dignity of someone enduring unjust accusations, but the measured confidence of a flag officer addressing peers. Thank you, sir. I understand the difficult position that security requirements created. No fault lies with this court for acting on the information available to them. Her gracious response only seemed to make Harrison angrier. Fleet Admiral, your generosity of spirit does you credit, but fault absolutely lies with this court. Proper procedures exist for a reason. Due diligence is required before filing charges against any officer, much less one of your stature. General Donovan stepped forward again, his expression grim. Admiral Morrison, Captain Westfield, you need to understand the full scope of what has occurred here. This proceeding has been monitored by hostile intelligence services. Foreign operatives have been recording testimony, cataloging witness statements, analyzing every piece of evidence presented. The implication hit the courtroom like a third explosion. If foreign intelligence had been monitoring the proceedings, then operational security hadn't just been compromised, it had been obliterated. Fleet Admiral Chen's cover identity, which took years to establish and has been crucial to multiple ongoing operations, has been blown. Assets she developed, networks she established, missions she planned, all of it is now compromised because this court couldn't be bothered to verify its evidence through proper channels. Morrison sank into his chair as the full weight of the catastrophe became clear. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or procedural error. This was a security disaster that would have implications for years to come. Harrison continued his systematic destruction of everything the court thought it knew. The operations you've compromised include current missions in the South China Sea, ongoing intelligence gathering in the Persian Gulf, and counter-terrorism efforts in 3 different theaters. American lives are now at risk because you insisted on prosecuting a case based on deliberately falsified records. Senior Chief Martinez, who had been sitting in the gallery since giving his testimony, stood slowly and approached the front of the courtroom. His face showed a mixture of shame and determination as he came to attention before Fleet Admiral Harrison. Sir, I request permission to correct my earlier testimony. Harrison studied the senior enlisted man with interest. Proceed, Senior Chief. Sir, I knew exactly who Fleet Admiral Chen was when I testified. I've served under her command in 2 different operations. I lied to this court, and I'd like to explain why. The admission sent yet another shock through the already reeling courtroom. Martinez, whose credibility had seemed unshakable, was admitting to perjury in a military court. Fleet Admiral Chen contacted me before these proceedings began, Martinez continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his admission. She ordered me to maintain her cover identity regardless of the personal cost to her. She specifically instructed me to provide testimony that would support the prosecution's case rather than reveal classified operations. Harrison's expression shifted to something that might have been respect. She ordered you to lie under oath to protect operational security. Yes, sir. And I followed that order because Fleet Admiral Chen has never given an order that didn't serve the greater good, even when it cost her personally. The senior chief turned to face Sarah, coming to attention with the perfect precision of a master-at-arms ceremony. "Ma'am, I apologize for the testimony I was forced to give. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, watching you take that punishment for following your oath." Sarah's composure finally cracked, just slightly. Tears gathered in her eyes as she looked at the senior chief who had been willing to commit perjury to protect operations he couldn't even discuss. "Senior Chief Martinez, you followed orders under impossible circumstances. No apology is necessary." As the implications of Martinez's revelation sank in, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from shock to something approaching awe. The junior officers in the gallery were beginning to understand that they had been witnessing something unprecedented, not just the exposure of a classified operation, but the revelation of the kind of leadership that existed in the upper echelons of their service. Harrison activated his tablet again, this time connecting it to the courtroom's display systems. "Ladies and gentlemen, since operational security has already been compromised beyond repair, I'm authorized to show you exactly what you've been unknowingly attacking for 3 days." The screens filled with operational photographs that took breath away from every military professional in the room. Sarah Chen in battle dress utilities, directing evacuation operations while explosions lit the sky behind her. Sarah in dress whites, shaking hands with heads of state whose identities were obscured, but whose importance was unmistakable. Sarah in tactical gear, emerging from a transport helicopter with rescued hostages visible in the background. But it was the final image that caused audible gasps throughout the gallery. Sarah Chen in dress whites, standing between the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense as she received the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor the nation could bestow. Fleet Admiral Chen is one of only 12 active-duty military officers to hold the Medal of Freedom, Harrison explained, his voice carrying undisguised pride. She received it for her role in preventing what intelligence analysts determined would have been the largest terrorist attack in American history. Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. "When?" 18 months ago, Admiral Morrison. While you were presiding over routine administrative hearings, Fleet Admiral Chen was coordinating international efforts to prevent nuclear materials from reaching terrorist organizations. General Donovan stepped forward again, his expression grim. The operation she commanded saved an estimated 100,000 civilian lives. The attack she prevented would have made 9/11 look like a minor incident. The numbers hit the courtroom like physical blows. 100,000 lives, nuclear materials, terrorist attacks on a scale that defied imagination. The woman they had been humiliating for 3 days had been protecting American civilians from horrors they couldn't even contemplate. Harrison continued his systematic revelation of Sarah's true service record. In the past 5 years alone, Fleet Admiral Chen has commanded or coordinated operations that resulted in the rescue of 847 American hostages, the prevention of 23 international incidents that could have led to armed conflict, and the disruption of terrorist networks in 15 different countries. Each statistic landed with devastating impact. These weren't abstract numbers. They represented real people, real families, real communities that existed because of decisions made by the woman sitting quietly at the defendant's table. Her tactical innovations in special operations have been adopted by NATO allies and have resulted in a 73% improvement in mission success rates for hostage rescue operations worldwide. Captain Westfield, his earlier confidence now completely shattered, attempted one last desperate challenge. "Sir, how do we verify any of this? How do we know these claims are any more legitimate than—" He never finished the sentence. General Donovan's expression was enough to stop the words in Westfield's throat. "Captain," Donovan said with deadly quiet, "you're asking the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to provide verification for operations that I personally authorized. You're questioning the word of a fleet admiral whose record has been verified by the President of the United States. You're suggesting that the Secretary of Defense might be lying about the Medal of Freedom recipient." The absurdity of Westfield's position became clear even to him. He was essentially accusing the highest levels of American military and civilian leadership of participating in an elaborate fraud to protect someone who had supposedly fabricated her service record. Harrison's tablet chimed softly, indicating an incoming message. He glanced at the screen and nodded to General Donovan. Ladies and gentlemen, Donovan announced, I've just received authorization to reveal one additional piece of information that should put any remaining questions to rest. The courtroom, already silent, somehow became even quieter. Fleet Admiral Chen's promotion to flag rank was personally approved by the President of the United States and confirmed by a closed session of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Her elevation to Fleet Admiral, the first person to hold that rank since World War II, was authorized by emergency presidential order following her successful coordination of the Taiwan Strait Crisis resolution. The revelation that Sarah held a rank that hadn't existed in over 70 years, that her promotion had required presidential emergency powers, that the Senate had confirmed her in closed session, it was beyond anything anyone in the courtroom had imagined possible. Morrison looked like a man who had just realized he had been committing career suicide in public. Sir, the emergency presidential order, was there no way to communicate this to military courts? Admiral Morrison, Harrison replied with barely controlled fury. There are exactly 7 people in the United States military with the clearance to know about Fleet Admiral Chen's true identity and mission parameters. You are not one of them. I am not one of them. The only reason General Donovan and I know is because we've just received emergency authorization to reveal this information to prevent further damage. Harrison paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the final blow. The President of the United States is personally monitoring these proceedings. The Secretary of Defense has canceled his diplomatic trip to address the security ramifications. The intelligence community is conducting emergency damage assessments to determine what operations can be salvaged. The idea that the President himself was watching their small military courtroom, that cabinet-level officials were being pulled from international commitments, that the intelligence community was scrambling to address the damage they had caused. It transformed the proceedings from a routine court-martial into a national security crisis. Senior Chief Martinez, still standing at attention, requested permission to speak again. Sir, there's something else this court needs to understand. Fleet Admiral Chen didn't just endure these proceedings to protect operational security. She endured them to protect us. Harrison nodded for him to continue. Every person who testified against her, everyone who participated in building the case against her, were all protected by her clearance and operational authority. If the truth had come out through normal legal channels, we would have faced charges for compromising classified information. Fleet Admiral Chen chose to accept disgrace and imprisonment rather than let her subordinates face the consequences of following orders they couldn't understand. The final revelation hit the courtroom with the force of a moral earthquake. Sarah hadn't just been protecting abstract operational security or distant classified missions. She had been protecting every person in that courtroom who had unknowingly participated in what amounted to a massive security breach. Morrison finally found his voice, though it was barely audible. Fleet Admiral Chen, what are your orders? Sarah stood again, and for the first time since the proceedings began, she carried herself with the full authority of her actual rank. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected global security. Admiral Morrison, you will dismiss all charges immediately. You will seal all records of these proceedings under national security classification. You will issue orders that no person present in this courtroom will discuss anything they have heard here today without proper security authorization. She paused, her gaze sweeping the gallery. And you will ensure that every person who testified, every person who participated in these proceedings, understands that they acted according to the information available to them. No fault lies with anyone in this courtroom except those who failed to follow proper verification procedures before filing charges against a flag officer. Even in her moment of vindication, even after 3 days of public humiliation, Sarah Chen's first concern was protecting the people who had unknowingly participated in attacking her. It was, perhaps, the most profound demonstration of leadership anyone in that courtroom had ever witnessed. The silence that followed Sarah's orders stretched for what felt like an eternity. 300 people sat motionless, their minds struggling to process the complete inversion of everything they thought they understood. The woman they had watched being systematically destroyed for 3 days had just issued orders with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding fleets and coordinating international crises. Admiral Morrison's hands trembled as he reached for his gavel. All charges against Fleet Admiral Chen are hereby dismissed. This court is... His voice broke slightly. This court is dissolved. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the absolute silence of the courtroom. But before anyone could move, before anyone could speak, something extraordinary happened. Senior Chief Martinez was the first. Still standing at attention before the bench, he slowly raised his right hand in a salute so precise, so perfectly rendered, that it seemed to embody every tradition of naval service. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of 23 years of faithful service. "My Fleet Admiral Chen, it has been the highest honor of my career to serve under your command." The salute hung in the air like a challenge to everyone present. Here was a senior enlisted man, the backbone of the Navy, the voice of experience and tradition, rendering the kind of respect that could not be faked, could not be manufactured, could only be earned through demonstrated leadership under the most extreme conditions. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres, a SEAL officer sitting in the third row, stood slowly. She had been one of the most vocal critics during the proceedings, convinced that Sarah was a fraud who dishonored legitimate special operators. Now, as understanding dawned, she came to attention with the fluid grace of someone whose life had been dedicated to military precision. Her salute was perfect, held with the kind of reverence usually reserved for fallen comrades or Medal of Honor recipients. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I apologize for doubting what I should have recognized." The gesture spread like a contagion of honor. One by one, officers throughout the gallery rose to their feet. Not because they were ordered to, not because protocol demanded it, but because they were witnessing something that transcended rank and regulation, the recognition of authentic leadership by those who understood its value. A Marine colonel who had served in 3 combat zones stood and saluted with tears streaming down his face. "Ma'am, semper fi. Thank you for your service." A Navy captain whose own chest bore the ribbons of distinguished command rose with the deliberate precision of someone who understood exactly what he was acknowledging. "Fleet Admiral, it's an honor." The wave of recognition spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Junior officers who had been smirking and whispering throughout the proceedings now stood in stunned reverence. Enlisted personnel who had enjoyed the spectacle of watching a supposed fraud being exposed now rendered salutes with the precision they reserved for the most solemn ceremonies. But it was the senior officers, the admirals and generals who had seen real leadership under pressure, whose reactions carried the most weight. These were men and women who had commanded in combat, who had made life and death decisions, who understood the true cost of the kind of service Sarah had rendered in silence. Vice Admiral Patricia Hawkins, commander of Naval Surface Forces, stood with the bearing of someone who had earned her stars through competence rather than politics. Her salute was held with profound respect as she spoke. "Fleet Admiral Chen, the Navy is honored to have you in our ranks." Rear Admiral James Mitchell, whose own special operations background gave him insight into what Sarah had truly accomplished, saluted with visible emotion. "Ma'am, what you've done, what you've sacrificed, it's beyond anything we had the right to ask." The salutes continued, spreading through every row of the gallery until the entire courtroom was standing at attention. 300 people rendering perfect military honors to a woman who had endured public humiliation rather than break faith with the oaths that protected American lives and global security. Fleet Admiral Harrison, who had been watching the spontaneous display with satisfaction, finally stepped forward. His own salute was rendered with the precision of someone who had spent nearly 5 decades perfecting the gesture, held with the profound respect one flag officer owed another. "Fleet Admiral Chen," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom, "on behalf of the United States Navy, thank you for your service, your sacrifice, and your unwavering commitment to the oaths we all swore to uphold." General Donovan followed, his salute carrying the weight of ultimate military authority. "Ma'am, You represent the very best of American military service. The nation owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Through it all, Sarah stood quietly at the defendant's table, accepting the recognition with the same dignified composure she had maintained during 3 days of humiliation. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her military bearing remained perfect as she returned each salute with the precision and respect it deserved. The display continued for several minutes, a sustained demonstration of respect and recognition that transformed the courtroom from a place of judgment to something approaching a shrine to military service and sacrifice. When the wave of salutes finally subsided and the courtroom began to settle, all eyes turned to the two men whose careers had been built on the systematic destruction of Sarah's reputation and dignity. Admiral Morrison remained behind his bench, his face ashen, his hands visibly shaking as the full magnitude of his error became impossible to ignore. For 37 years, he had built his career on being right, on exercising sound judgment, on commanding respect through competent leadership. In the space of 30 minutes, all of that had been revealed as a carefully constructed facade hiding fundamental incompetence. He had humiliated a fleet admiral. He had compromised national security operations. He had endangered the lives of American operators in the field. He had turned a routine court proceeding into a diplomatic crisis that required presidential intervention. Captain Westfield stood beside his table, his carefully organized files now seeming to mock his previous confidence. His perfect conviction record, his reputation for thorough preparation, his political connections, none of it mattered now. He had built his career on destroying people who, it turned out, had been protecting the very nation he claimed to serve. Fleet Admiral Harrison's gaze fell on Morrison with the weight of final judgment. "Admiral Morrison, I need you to understand something. The damage you've done today extends far beyond this courtroom, far beyond Fleet Admiral Chen's personal reputation, far beyond even the operational security you've compromised." Morrison tried to speak, but Harrison continued without pause. "You have undermined the faith that our most dedicated officers have in the system they serve. You have demonstrated that following orders, maintaining oaths, and sacrificing personal interests for national security can lead to public humiliation and career destruction. You have shown every classified operator in American service that their dedication and sacrifice can be rewarded with disgrace and imprisonment." The words hit Morrison like physical blows, each one driving home the broader implications of what he had done. How many future operations will fail because operators doubt that their sacrifice will be honored? How many potential recruits will choose other paths because they've seen what happens to those who serve in silence? How many allies will question American operational security after watching classified information exposed in open court? General Donovan stepped forward, his expression grim. "Admiral Morrison, you have created a national security crisis that will take years to fully resolve. Foreign intelligence services now have detailed information about American operational procedures, command structures, and security protocols that they gained by simply monitoring a supposedly routine court-martial." Morrison finally found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "Sir, I had no way of knowing. The defendant refused to provide any evidence, refused to explain her actions, based on the information available to me. Based on the information available to you, you should have conducted proper verification before filing charges against a flag officer," Harrison interrupted coldly. "You should have followed established procedures for investigating claims of classified service. You should have recognized that a decorated officer's refusal to defend herself might indicate something more complex than guilt or arrogance." Harrison's voice grew harder with each word. "Instead, you chose to turn this proceeding into a spectacle. You played to the gallery, you invited media attention, you treated the systematic destruction of a decorated officer's reputation as entertainment for your personal aggrandizement." The accurate characterization of Morrison's behavior throughout the trial caused visible flinches from several officers in the gallery who had witnessed his theatrical grandstanding. General Donovan addressed both Morrison and Westfield directly. Gentlemen, your careers in military service are over. Admiral Morrison, you will tender your resignation immediately. Captain Westfield, you will face charges for prosecutorial misconduct, failure to conduct adequate investigation, and contributing to a national security breach. Morrison's face went from ashen to gray. Sir, I respectfully request the opportunity to... There is no opportunity for anything except damage control, Donovan cut him off. Fleet Admiral Chen has shown more grace and professionalism in her response to your incompetence than either of you deserve. Your only option now is to accept responsibility for your failures and cooperate fully with the investigation into how this disaster occurred. Westfield, his political instincts still functioning despite the catastrophe, attempted to shift responsibility. General Donovan, with respect, the prosecution acted on evidence provided by Naval Personnel Command. If there were errors in the investigation... His words died as Sarah herself stood and addressed him directly. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, but also a sadness that spoke to the personal cost of what had transpired. Captain Westfield, the evidence you received was accurate according to the information available through normal channels. Your error was not in trusting that evidence, but in failing to recognize that some situations require investigation beyond normal channels. Even in her moment of vindication, even after 3 days of systematic character assassination, Sarah's first instinct was to acknowledge the complexity of the situation rather than simply destroy her accusers. You built your case on the assumption that a serving officer would fabricate extraordinary claims for personal gain. That assumption might be valid in many circumstances, but it failed to account for the possibility that some service occurs in shadows specifically designed to make verification impossible through standard procedures. Her willingness to acknowledge the logical foundation of the case against her, even while exposing its fundamental flaws, demonstrated a level of intellectual honesty and professional grace that left observers stunned. Morrison, perhaps recognizing that this might be his last opportunity to salvage some shred of dignity from the wreckage of his career, stood slowly and faced Sarah directly. "Fleet Admiral Chen," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse, "I offer you my most profound apologies. My conduct throughout these proceedings was inexcusable, regardless of the information available to me. You maintained dignity and honor under the most extreme provocation, while I allowed personal prejudice and professional arrogance to cloud my judgment." It was perhaps the most honest statement Morrison had made during the entire proceeding. The acknowledgement of personal prejudice, the admission that he had allowed his preconceptions about what a hero should look like to influence his professional judgment, carried more weight than any formal apology could have. Morrison removed the insignia from his uniform with hands that shook only slightly. "I tender my resignation from the United States Navy, effective immediately. The service deserves better leadership than I have provided." The gesture was performed with the dignity of someone who understood that accepting responsibility was the only path to preserving any measure of honor from the situation. Sarah accepted his apology with a simple nod, neither gloating over his fall nor attempting to minimize the damage he had caused. Her response demonstrated the kind of leadership that transcends personal vindication to focus on the broader needs of the service and the nation. As the immediate crisis of accountability began to resolve, Fleet Admiral Morrison turned his attention to the broader implications of what had been revealed. The courtroom, which had been focused on individual drama and personal vindication, now had to grapple with systemic changes that would affect the entire military justice system. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced, addressing the gallery with the authority of someone used to briefing congressional committees and international allies, "what has occurred here today requires fundamental changes in how we handle cases involving potentially classified service." He activated his tablet again, displaying new directives that had clearly been prepared in anticipation of this moment. Effective immediately, the Secretary of the Navy is implementing new protocols for any court-martial involving claims of classified service or disputed decorations. The protocols appeared on the courtroom screens, outlining verification procedures, security clearances required for prosecution teams, and mandatory consultation with intelligence communities before filing charges. The changes were comprehensive, designed to prevent any repetition of the security disaster they had witnessed. Furthermore, Harrison continued, Congress will be briefed on the operational security implications of today's proceedings. New legislation is being drafted to provide legal protections for officers serving in classified capacities while maintaining accountability for legitimate cases of fraud. The announcement that congressional involvement was required spoke to the magnitude of the crisis. Military justice systems operated largely independently of civilian oversight, but the national security implications of what had occurred demanded higher-level attention. General Donovan stepped forward to address the operational implications. The intelligence community is conducting emergency assessments of all operations that may have been compromised by today's revelations. Allied services are being briefed to ensure that shared operations can continue despite the security breach. He paused, his expression growing grave. Some operations will have to be terminated. Some assets will need to be extracted or relocated. Some intelligence networks that took years to establish will have to be rebuilt from scratch. The operational costs of the proceedings were becoming clear. Real missions affecting real American interests and the safety of real people had been damaged or destroyed by what had begun as a routine stolen valor case. Sarah, who had remained quietly at attention during these administrative discussions, finally spoke. Sir, I request permission to address the operational impacts directly. Harrison nodded. Proceed, Fleet Admiral. The compromise of my cover identity requires immediate restructuring of 3 ongoing operations in the Pacific Theater. Asset networks in 2 allied countries will need emergency extraction protocols initiated within 48 hours. Intelligence sharing agreements with 4 NATO allies will require renegotiation to address security concerns. Her clinical assessment of the damage was delivered without emotion or blame, focusing entirely on practical requirements for damage control. Even in describing the destruction of 8 years of careful operational development, her primary concern was ensuring that other operators and American interests were protected. Additionally, she continued, all personnel who testified in these proceedings will require security debriefings to ensure they understand the classified nature of information they may have inadvertently been exposed to. Harrison nodded grimly. Understood. Those debriefings will begin immediately after these proceedings conclude. He turned to address the gallery directly. Everyone present in this courtroom today has been exposed to classified information that affects ongoing operations and national security. You are now bound by the same security oaths that Fleet Admiral Chen has honored throughout her career. The weight of that responsibility settled over the 300 people present. They had come to witness what they thought was a routine military justice proceeding, and now found themselves bound by oaths of secrecy that would affect them for the rest of their lives. You will not discuss what you have heard here today with anyone lacking proper security clearance. You will not speculate about operations or identities that have been revealed. You will not share information through any medium, official or personal, written or verbal, direct or implied. The comprehensive nature of the restrictions drove home just how serious the security breach had been. These weren't routine courtroom proceedings that could be discussed over drinks or shared in letters home. This was classified information that could affect American lives and national security. Fleet Admiral Harrison's final announcement carried the weight of ultimate authority. Fleet Admiral Chen, on behalf of the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of Defense, and the President of the United States, I formally apologize for the failure of our systems to protect your operational security and personal dignity. He paused, ensuring his next words carried appropriate weight. You are hereby authorized to resume your classified duties with full operational authority. Command of Joint Task Force Trident is restored to you effective immediately, along with all operational authorities and security clearances associated with that position. The restoration of her command meant that Sarah would return immediately to coordinating some of the most sensitive military operations in American service. The woman who had spent 3 days being accused of fraud was being entrusted with responsibilities that affected global security. Additionally, Harrison continued, you are awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for your conduct throughout these proceedings. Your maintenance of operational security under extreme personal cost exemplifies the highest traditions of naval service. The award of an additional decoration, particularly one recognizing her behavior during the trial itself, served as an official acknowledgement that her actions had been not just appropriate, but exemplary. Senior Chief Martinez, who had remained at attention throughout the administrative proceedings, requested permission to speak one final time. Sir, I'd like the record to reflect that Fleet Admiral Chen's conduct throughout these proceedings provides a model for every person wearing the uniform of the United States military. Her willingness to accept personal disgrace rather than compromise operations that protect American lives represents the highest form of service. His statement was endorsed by nods throughout the gallery. Officers who had initially enjoyed watching Sarah's supposed downfall now understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of leadership that transcended personal interest to serve larger purposes. As the formal proceedings drew to a close, Sarah remained standing at attention, accepting the various announcements and directives with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout 3 days of humiliation. Her vindication was complete, but her demeanor suggested that personal validation had never been her primary concern. The courtroom began to empty slowly, officers filing out in small groups, their conversations muted by the weight of what they had witnessed and the security restrictions now binding them. The reporters, their stories killed by classification orders, left with the frustrated expressions of professionals whose biggest scoop had become their biggest secret. As the gallery cleared, Fleet Admiral Morrison approached Sarah directly. "Fleet Admiral, what are your immediate requirements for operational transition?" Sarah's response was immediate and precise. "Sir, I'll need secure communication with Pacific Command within the hour to assess current operational status. Emergency extraction protocols should be initiated for assets Lima 7 and Delta 3 immediately. Intelligence briefings on current threat assessments for the 3 compromised operations should be prepared for review by 1800 hours." Her instant return to operational thinking, her immediate focus on mission requirements rather than personal recognition, demonstrated why she had been entrusted with such extraordinary authority in the first place. Morrison nodded approvingly. "All requirements will be met. Transport to your operational headquarters is standing by." As Sarah prepared to leave the courtroom, where she had endured 3 days of systematic humiliation, she paused to address the few remaining officers. "Gentlemen, what occurred here today resulted from systemic failures, not individual malice. I trust that lessons learned will be applied to prevent similar situations in the future, and that no person present will face adverse consequences for actions taken in good faith based on available information." Her final statement in the courtroom was characteristically focused on the welfare of others rather than celebration of her own vindication. Even in her moment of complete triumph, her primary concern was ensuring that people who had unknowingly participated in attacking her would not suffer lasting consequences. Fleet Admiral Sarah Chen left the courtroom as she had entered it, quietly, with dignity, focused entirely on the mission rather than personal recognition. But she left as someone whose true stature had been revealed, whose sacrifice had been acknowledged, and whose commitment to service above self had been demonstrated beyond any possible doubt. The courtroom doors closed behind her, and the most extraordinary military justice proceeding in American history became another classified secret, protected by the same oaths of silence that had nearly destroyed the woman it was meant to honor. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget?